Chosen ones, God says, justice hit her 3 hours ago. The rain had been falling for 17 hours straight, the kind of Karachi monsoon that turns streets into black mirrors and makes every horn sound like a scream underwater. Ayesha sat on the edge of her narrow balcony on the 6th floor of a crumbling building in Lyari. Her phone was face down on the wet railing. It had been vibrating non-stop for the last 40 minutes. She hadn't touched it since 4:17 p.m. 3 hours earlier, at exactly 1:17 p.m., something shifted in the atmosphere. Not metaphorically, literally. The ceiling fan in her tiny one-room apartment had suddenly stopped mid-spin, frozen like a bird that forgot how to fly. The lights didn't flicker, they simply surrendered. Every bulb in the building went dark at the same second. Phones died. The neighbor's inverter gave a single dying cough. Even the street dogs outside stopped barking. Silence thicker than the humidity pressed down. And in that silence, Ayesha heard it. Not a voice, not words exactly, more like pressure behind her eyes that turned into meaning. 3 hours. That was all. No explanation, no emotion. Just 3 words that tasted like iron and ozone. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, took out the small black diary she hadn't opened in 4 years, and wrote one sentence on a fresh page. Today, justice arrives. 1:17 p.m. Then she closed the book, placed it back exactly where it had been, and went to sit on the balcony to wait. She waited through the 2nd hour while the rain tried to wash the city clean. She waited through the 3rd hour while the power came back in stuttering waves and people began shouting again. At 4:17 p.m., exactly 3 hours later, her phone finally stopped vibrating. One final message came through, from an unknown number, just 4 words. It's done. He's gone. Ayesha didn't open the message. She already knew. 3 hours earlier, in a marble-floored farmhouse on the outskirts of the city, the man who had destroyed her life for 6 straight years had been sitting on a cream leather sofa laughing at something on his phone. His name was Rayhan, ex-husband, businessman, collector of broken women, protected by money, connections, and the kind of luck that makes people whisper, "How is he still walking free?" At 1:17 p.m. precisely, Rayhan suddenly stood up. He looked confused, then frightened, then terrified. According to the 3 servants who survived, he started clawing at his own throat as if something invisible was tightening around it. He screamed that his lungs were burning from the inside. He begged for water, for air, for mercy. None came. The doctors would later write, "sudden catastrophic pulmonary hemorrhage of unknown origin." The newspapers would call it a tragic medical event. The people who knew the truth would call it something else entirely. They would call it justice that had been waiting 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days to collect its debt. Back on the balcony, Ayesha finally turned her phone over. She didn't read the messages. She didn't need to. She opened the camera, switched to selfie mode, and looked at herself for the first time in 3 hours. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. There was no joy, no relief, no victory dance. Just quiet. The same quiet that had filled the room when God spoke 3 simple words into her soul. She whispered to her own reflection, voice barely louder than the rain. I never asked for his death. I only asked for the pain to stop being mine alone. Then she stood up, walked inside, opened the black diary again, and beneath her earlier sentence wrote one final line. Paid in full, 4:17 p.m. She closed the book, locked the drawer, and for the first time in 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days, she breathed without feeling the weight of someone else's sin pressing on her chest. Somewhere far above the storm clouds, something ancient turned its face away. Not in disappointment, not in approval. Just finished. Because sometimes the universe doesn't need a long trial, doesn't need witnesses, doesn't need evidence. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives exactly 3 hours after God says, enough. And when it does, there is no appeal, there is no defense. There is only the sound of something finally breaking and the silence that follows. The kind of silence that feels like peace, even if it tastes like iron, even if it burns, even if it came 3 hours late, or 3 hours early, depending on whose clock you're reading. But to the chosen ones, the ones who waited in silence, who never cursed, who never begged for blood, to them, 3 hours can feel like forever, and also like nothing at all. Because when God finally speaks, time itself gets embarrassed and hurries to catch up. The monsoon in Karachi that year was relentless, a biblical deluge that seemed to mock the city's fragile infrastructure. For 17 straight hours, the rain had hammered down, turning the narrow alleys of Liari into swollen rivers of mud and forgotten debris. Street vendors had long since abandoned their carts, and the air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth mixed with the faint, acrid tang of overflowing sewers. In the midst of this chaos, on the 6th floor of a weathered apartment block that leaned slightly to one side, like an old man weary from too many storms, Ayesha perched on the edge of her narrow balcony. The railing was slick with rain, and her phone lay face down beside her, its screen a black void reflecting the stormy sky. It had been vibrating incessantly for the last 40 minutes, each buzz a tiny earthquake against the metal. But Ayesha hadn't touched it, not since 4:17 p.m. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the Arabian Sea met the gray clouds in a hazy blur, as if the world itself was dissolving. She was 32 years old, with the kind of quiet beauty that life had tried and failed to erode. Her dark hair clung to her shoulders in wet strands, and her dupatta, once a vibrant red, was now a sodden rag draped over her lap. She didn't shiver, though the wind whipped through the balcony like an uninvited guest. She simply waited. 3 hours earlier, at precisely 1:17 p.m., the world had paused, not in the poetic sense, but in a way that defied explanation. The ceiling fan in her cramped one-room apartment, a relic from better days with blades caked in dust, had frozen mid-rotation, its hum silenced as if someone had yanked the plug from the universe itself. The lights didn't flicker or dim, they extinguished in unison, every bulb in the building surrendering to an unseen force. Phones across the floor went dead, their screens blanking out like eyes closing in sleep. The neighbor's inverter, usually a reliable growl during power cuts, let out a single pathetic cough before falling silent. Even the street dogs below, those mangy guardians of the alleyways who barked at shadows, hushed as if commanded by an invisible master. The silence that followed was profound, thicker than the humidity that clung to everything in Karachi's summers. It pressed against Ayesha's eardrums, a vacuum that sucked the breath from her lungs. And in that void, she heard it, not with her ears, but as a pressure building behind her eyes, a vibration in her skull that coalesced into meaning. It wasn't a voice, not in the human sense. It didn't boom like thunder or whisper like wind. It was iron and ozone, the taste of a storm about to break. 3 hours. That was all. No preamble, no elaboration, just those 2 words, 3 syllables that hung in her mind like a promise etched in stone. Ayesha didn't gasp or scream. She didn't question it or doubt. Instead, a calm settled over her, the kind that comes after years of carrying a burden so heavy it becomes part of your skeleton. She rose from her worn charpoy bed, her bare feet padding softly across the cracked tile floor, and made her way to the small kitchenette. There, in the bottom drawer of a rickety cabinet, hidden beneath stacks of old bills and faded photographs, she retrieved a small black diary. It was leather-bound, edges frayed from time, and she hadn't opened it in 4 years, not since the last entry, a desperate scrawl of pain and plea. With steady hands, she flipped to a fresh page, the paper yellowed but pristine. Her pen hovered for a moment, then descended. Today, justice arrives. 1:17 p.m. She closed the diary with a soft snap, returned it to its hiding place, and locked the drawer with a key she kept around her neck. Then, without a word, she stepped out onto the balcony to wait. The rain continued its assault, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the fragments of a life that had led her here. Ayesha's story wasn't unique in Karachi, a city where dreams and despair danced in the shadows of towering billboards and crumbling colonial facades. 6 years ago, she had been a young teacher, full of optimism, married to Rehan, a charming businessman with a smile that could disarm anyone and connections that reached into the highest echelons of power. He came from money, the kind that bought silence and loyalty. Their wedding had been a spectacle, fairy lights strung across a lavish lawn, guests in designer shalwar kameez, and promises whispered under a canopy of jasmine. But beneath the gloss, cracks formed quickly. Rehan's charm masked a darkness. The first slap came 3 months in, over a dinner she had burned while grading papers. "You think you're better than me?" he'd snarled, his hand leaving a red imprint on her cheek. It escalated from there. Bruises hidden under long sleeves, nights locked in the bathroom sobbing silently, threats that if she left, he'd ensure she never taught again, never saw her family. He collected women like trophies, affairs flaunted in whispers among their social circle, but no one intervened. Money talked, justice walked away. Ayesha endured for 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She prayed in the quiet hours before dawn, not for revenge, but for the pain to stop being hers alone. She whispered to God in the masjid's corner, her forehead pressed to the cool prayer mat. "If you see me, make it right, not with blood, but with balance." Divorce came eventually, a hollow victory in a court that favored the wealthy. Rehan walked free, unscathed, while she retreated to this Lyari apartment, piecing together a life from tutoring gigs and the remnants of her dignity. As the second hour ticked by on the balcony, the rain intensified, drumming a rhythmic tattoo on the tin roof above. Neighbors shouted from windows, complaining about the blackout, but Ayesha remained still. Memories flooded her. The night Rehan had thrown her against the wall, cracking a rib. The hospital visit where she lied about falling downstairs. The friends who drifted away, uncomfortable with her truth. She didn't cry now. The waiting had burned away the tears. In the third hour, power flickered back in waves, lights stuttering to life like hesitant heartbeats. The city resumed its cacophony, horns blaring, vendors calling out, children splashing in puddles. Ayesha's phone buzzed to life with it, messages piling up from unknown numbers, from old acquaintances, from the void. She ignored them all, her eyes on the clock in her mind. At 4:17 p.m., exactly 3 hours later, the vibrations ceased. One final message pinged through from an anonymous sender. "It's done. He's gone." She didn't need to read it. She knew. 30 kilometers away, in a sprawling marble-floored farmhouse on the outskirts of Karachi, nestled among manicured gardens and high walls topped with barbed wire, Rehan had been lounging on a cream leather sofa. The air conditioning hummed softly, insulating him from the storm outside. At 50, he looked 10 years younger, thanks to gym routines and the best dermatologists money could buy. He was scrolling through his phone, laughing at a meme shared in one of his elite WhatsApp groups. Politicians, businessmen, the untouchables of society. At 1:17 p.m. precisely, he bolted upright. His face twisted in confusion, then fear. What's happening?" he gasped, clutching his chest. The 3 servants in the room, a cook, a driver, and a maid, froze as he staggered to his feet. He clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, as if an invisible noose was tightening. "Air! I can't! It's burning!" His lungs felt like they were filled with molten lead, each breath a razor slicing from within. He collapsed to his knees, begging for water, for help, for mercy. The servants rushed forward, one dialing an ambulance, another fetching a glass, but it was too late. Blood flecked his lips, then poured in a torrent. He convulsed, his body arching in agony, before going still. The paramedics, arriving 20 minutes later amid the downpour, pronounced him dead on the scene. Autopsy would later reveal sudden catastrophic pulmonary hemorrhage of unknown origin, lungs flooded with blood as if scorched from the inside. No poison, no trauma, no explanation. The newspapers spun it as a tragic medical anomaly, a heartbreaker for the business community. Whispers in elite circles called it karma, a settling of scores. But those who knew Ayesha's story, few as they were, recognized it for what it was. Justice delayed, now delivered with divine precision. 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days of accumulated debt, paid in full in a matter of minutes. Back on the balcony, Ayesha finally picked up her phone. She didn't scroll through the messages, condolences mixed with accusations, questions from reporters who somehow gotten her number. Instead, she opened the camera app, switched to selfie mode, and stared at her reflection. Her eyes were calm, unnaturally so, like the eye of the storm raging around her. No triumph gleamed there, no shadows of regret, just a profound quiet, the absence of weight. "I never asked for his death," she whispered to the screen, her voice lost in the rain's roar. "I only asked for the pain to stop being mine alone, for the scales to tip back." She stood, retreating inside as the wind howled. The black diary came out again, and beneath her earlier entry she added, "Paid in full, 4:17 p.m." Locking it away, she moved to the window, watching the city pulse back to life. For the first time in years, she breathed deeply, her chest free of the invisible chains. The rain began to ease, as if the heavens themselves were satisfied. Somewhere far above the retreating clouds, in the vast machinery of the cosmos, something ancient and impartial shifted its gaze, not in judgment or celebration, but in completion. The universe, it seemed, didn't require grand trials or human witnesses. It didn't need evidence presented in courtrooms or pleas shouted into the void. Sometimes justice was a quiet decree, issued in the language of thunder and silence. It arrived not with fanfare, but with the inexorable tick of a cosmic clock. 3 hours after a simple edict, enough. And in that arrival, there was no room for appeals, no bargaining with fate, only the breaking of a long-held chain and the silence that followed, a silence that tasted like iron, burned like fire, but felt at last like peace. To the chosen ones, those who endured without bitterness, who prayed without demanding blood, 3 hours could stretch like eternity or vanish like a breath. Because when the divine finally intervenes, time itself bends, hurrying to align with a will older than the stars. In Karachi that night, as the streets dried and life resumed, Ayesha slept soundly for years. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean, and one soul, finally, unburdened.